The heavy shackles on Bjorn's wrists mercilessly chafed his bones raw after 3 years of grueling labor, dragging dead whales across Norway's icy shores. His hands had become bloody stumps, stretched over fractured bone. Yet, the greedy whaling master still needed his living slave for another season. At just 19 years old, Bjorn weighed a mere 66 pounds and had lost his voice 8 months prior, his throat burned by the caustic whale oil smoke he was forced to inhale 12 hours a day. His nightmarish job involved crawling inside decomposing whale carcasses to scrape out every precious drop of blubber, while toxic methane caused terrifying hallucinations, making him believe his deceased mother was calling his name from the afterlife. As the harsh winter set in, he was chained inside a reeking whale processing pit to prevent escape, spending 4 long months inhaling only the nauseating stench of decaying whale flesh mixed with his own waste. It is widely known that Vikings were fearless warriors, sailing oceans in search of plunder and conquest. History books depict them with gleaming swords and magnificent ships, striking terror into the hearts of their enemies. But for every legendary Viking warrior, there were approximately 50 others condemned to jobs so horrific that death would have been a welcome release from suffering. These were not the Vikings of songs and legends. These were the ones who disappeared into the depths of tasks so dangerous and repulsive that even other Vikings preferred to pretend they didn't exist. Viking civilization was built on a foundation of inhuman suffering, so brutal that the fortunate would have preferred a swift death in battle. Children as young as 12 were sold into slavery to extract whale blubber because their fragile bodies could penetrate deep into the whale's intestines to scrape out every valuable drop. These unfortunate children were called gut crawlers, and most died within 2 years from methane poisoning or being crushed when whale carcasses unexpectedly shifted. Survivors developed a terrible condition where their skin permanently turned yellow from absorbing whale toxins. They emitted such a repulsive odor that even their own families would not allow them into their homes. One whale could produce enough blubber to light an entire Viking settlement for 3 months. But extracting this blubber required gut crawlers to spend up to 16 hours inside a decomposing carcass. The methane concentration inside dead whales was so high that it caused instant hallucinations. Yet the children had to continue working despite visions of their dead relatives and imaginary monsters attacking them. Many gut crawlers emerged from the whale carcasses, talking to people who weren't there. Convinced that the dead whales were still alive and conversing with them, they failed to notice as rising water caused the whale carcass to shift and compress, crushing anyone still inside. Rescue attempts were impossible because methane killed adult rescuers within minutes. Families had to listen to their children's heart-wrenching screams from inside the whale, unable to help them. These screams typically lasted about 4 hours before the children suffocated or were crushed to death. Whale blubber masters discovered that children who survived the first year developed an immunity to the toxic gases, making them incredibly valuable. These surviving gut crawlers were worth more than 3 adult slaves. Their owners, therefore, severed their leg tendons to prevent escape attempts. They spent their entire lives crawling on rotting whale flesh, unable to walk, unable to run, unable to die. Equally horrific was the fate of blood eagle carvers. These individuals had to slice open a living person's back, break their ribs one by one, and pull their lungs out, keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. The carvers inhaled so much blood spray that most developed lung infections within months. Their hands were permanently stained red because human blood contains iron, which binds to skin tissues. After 5 executions, most blood eagle carvers began to experience such intense nightmares that they would attack their own families in their sleep. Blood eagle executions had to follow precise procedures to appease the gods, meaning carvers could not rush the process, even as victims screamed in agony. Ribs had to be broken in a specific sequence, starting from the bottom and working upwards. Each break required exactly 3 hammer blows, and the victim's lungs had to be pulled out while remaining attached to create the effect of eagle wings. This required keeping the person alive despite massive blood loss and organ trauma. Carvers who made mistakes were forced to start over with a new victim, while the botched execution was left to suffer until they died a natural death. Apprentices first trained on pigs, then on condemned criminals already fated to die. The psychological selection process excluded anyone who showed signs of empathy or hesitation, leaving only candidates who demonstrated a complete ability to ignore human suffering. Most successful carvers had already killed family members or close friends before being accepted for training, but remaining sober meant reliving every detail of slowly torturing a person to death. Many carvers attempted to drink before executions and were immediately killed by their community for showing disrespect to the gods. This work created individuals who were both indispensable to Viking justice and utterly insane from the trauma they endured. They lived alone, died alone, and were buried in unmarked graves because even in death, no one wanted to be associated with them. The arduous labor of the Vikings was inextricably linked to the harsh living conditions they inhabited. Extracting bog iron, essential for making weapons and tools, was fraught with immense difficulties. For days on end, standing chest-deep in icy bog water, miners waded through layers of decaying vegetation and animal remains in search of small deposits of iron ore. This work led to the development of bog lungs, a disease where the lungs filled with methane and organic matter, causing miners to cough up black sludge for the rest of their lives. Working underwater, they held their breath for up to 3 minutes, digging in marshy terrain that held centuries of decomposed remains. To obtain just 500 grams of ore, they had to sift through about 900 kilograms of bog material. Their daily labor involved processing a vast amount of toxic bog matter, enough to fill a small structure, all while constantly immersed in icy water that caused hypothermia. Miners used a bog breathing technique, intentionally hyperventilating before submerging to increase their breath-holding time. However, this often led to fainting and drowning in the bog. The bog water teemed with bacteria that had fed on decomposing organic matter for centuries, causing infections that modern medicine would deem lethal. Any cuts sustained during the work resulted in gangrene within 6 hours, and the only salvation was immediate amputation, performed with the same iron tools used for mining the ore. By the end of their second year of work, most miners had lost at least 3 fingers, but continued to toil as Viking society offered no support for the disabled. The toxicity of the bog water was so high that open wounds became infected within hours, leading to rapidly spreading gangrene. Many miners lost fingers, toes, or entire limbs due to infections, but continued working due to a lack of social support. They lived in huts built directly over the bogs, surrounded by the constant smell of methane and decaying organic matter. Their average life expectancy was 26 years, and most died from their lungs filling with bog debris. Berserkers, the legendary warriors, entered a battle frenzy by consuming a mixture of mushrooms, fermented fish oil, and human blood. However, history omits the fact that preparing this potion was a constant job performed by specialized feeders who had to test each batch on themselves to ensure its efficacy. These individuals spent days in a state of partial overdose, experiencing hallucinations, severe convulsions, and periods where they could not distinguish reality from nightmare. The Berserker's narcotic potion had to be prepared daily, as the mushroom component became toxic just 12 hours after preparation. The feeders woke at 3 a.m. to begin the preparation process, which included consuming small quantities of each ingredient to check for proper fermentation and potency. By sunrise, most were already experiencing mild hallucinations and muscle tremors from the test doses, but still had to complete the preparation while in a drugged state. The mushroom component was harvested from a special variety that grew only on human graves and was collected during a full moon to preserve its potency. Feeders spent nights in cemeteries, scraping mushrooms from decomposing corpses, experiencing drug-induced visions in which they believed the dead were trying to communicate with them. Many developed a condition where they could only sleep in cemeteries, feeling safe surrounded by friendly spirits who understood their suffering. To build tolerance to the blood component of the battle drug, feeders consumed fresh human blood daily, with blood from different people, warriors, children, the elderly, having different effects on the drug. As a result, their bodies stopped processing regular food, and they could only survive on blood and a mixture of fermented fish oil. Most feeders died within 3 years from organ failure caused by the constant drug toxicity, their minds utterly destroyed by chronic hallucinations. The tragic fates of Viking funeral pyre executioners unfolded in the hellish flames of cremations. They were obligated to maintain an unceasing heat, ensuring the bodies of the deceased were completely reduced to ash. Temperatures exceeding 1800 degrees, 980 degrees, were required for many hours, incinerating not only the dead but also the living. The work was so unbearable that shifts lasted only 15 minutes before the invisible rays of heat began to destroy internal organs. The inevitable lot of these workers included unhealing burns, and their lungs gradually filled with a deadly mixture of ash and bone dust, condemning them to slow suffocation. Fuel for the funeral pyres was required in enormous quantities, over 3 tons of wood per body. Workers, risking their lives, ceaselessly fed wood into the raging flames, often setting their own clothing alight. They devised a protective method, soaking their clothes in water before each shift, but even this did not save them from suffering. The water instantly turned into scalding steam, causing burns sometimes more agonizing than direct contact with fire. Different bodies required individual approaches. Children's bodies burned too quickly, not allowing for all necessary rituals. Workers then employed special methods, slowing the burning process while ensuring complete destruction. The bodies of obese individuals presented another danger: sudden flare-ups when fat ignited, creating fireballs capable of killing anyone within 15 meters. Workers, wielding iron tools, crushed bones, and moved body parts to ensure complete combustion, often under the watchful eyes of relatives who demanded reverence for their loved ones' remains. Bone dust and smoke from burning human fat settled in the workers' lungs, eventually hardening and turning the respiratory system into a cement-like bag. They died, drowning in their own petrified lungs. Priests who led victims to the altar prepared for ritual killings, sedating them with drugs, purifying and arranging their bodies according to the gods' requirements. The potions meant to calm the condemned were so potent that they permeated the priest's skin, causing chronic addiction and brain damage. Most suffered from tremors, memory lapses, and periods of complete unconsciousness, performing their duties without awareness of what was happening. The psychological trauma of preparing dozens of people for death transformed the priests into beings incapable of emotional connection with others. They lost empathy, ceased to experience normal feelings, and suffered nightmares of those they had sent to the afterlife. Many attempted suicide, but Viking law demanded they remain alive and serve the gods. They were assigned guards to prevent them from escaping their fate through death. The fate of scouts, forced to survive alone in the wilderness for weeks with minimal supplies, was no less tragic. They often had to eat tree bark and their own leather gear to avoid starvation. Many lost fingers and toes to frostbite, but were not permitted to return until their mission was complete. Scouts carried food for only 3 days, then had to rely on hunting, gathering, and anything they could find, including leather from clothing and ammunition. In the absence of customary food, they gnawed on tree bark, bit their fingernails, and in extreme cases ate flesh from their frost-bitten limbs. which had already lost sensation from the cold. The hardships of isolation and constant physical suffering turned scouts into individuals incapable of normal communication. Many attacked anyone who approached them without warning, their survival instincts so sharpened that they couldn't distinguish friends from foes. Military command knew this and quarantined returning scouts for several weeks to allow them to adapt to human society before sending them on new assignments. Isolation and bitter cold often led to ice madness, a condition where scouts began talking to imaginary companions and making decisions based on hallucinations induced by hypothermia. Surviving scouts struggled to adapt to normal life and attacked those who tried to touch them or speak without warning. Viking armies used winter scouts as expendable, assuming they would perish during their missions and replacing them with novices unaware of what truly awaited them. The arduous work of rune executioners, who specialized in creating cursed tablets, required carving symbols directly onto the bones of the deceased. It was believed that for the curse to be effective, the bones had to be fresh and bloody. The bone dust generated during this process contained blood and bone marrow, which penetrated under the carver's fingernails and into micro fissures on their hands, causing ceaseless infections. These masters of curses emitted a peculiar odor due to the infected bone dust ingrained in their skin, detectable from a distance. They lived in constant fear, believing that any mistake in their work could turn the curse against themselves. This fear led to trembling hands and, consequently, fatal errors. Many of them died of heart attacks, convinced that their own mistakes had doomed them to death. The few who survived and left this work spent the rest of their days in isolation, certain that they carried numerous misdirected curses. No less horrifying was the fate of the live ballast overseers on ships. Their job was to keep slaves alive in the ship's hold, their bodies used to stabilize the vessel during storms. The holds where this live cargo was kept lacked ventilation, light, and basic sanitation. Overseers were forced to spend entire days there, inhaling toxic air, which led to the development of lung infections within weeks of starting the job. Slaves were arranged in a specific order for optimal weight distribution, requiring overseers to constantly move unconscious or dying individuals. During storms, the ballast constantly shifted, forcing overseers to work around the clock, rearranging bodies amidst heavy pitching and rolling. The overseers themselves were chained to the walls to prevent them from being crushed by the shifting ballast, but this deprived them of any means of escape when the ballast died and began to decompose around them. Long sea voyages turned into a nightmare as overseers had to remove dead bodies and replace them with survivors to maintain the ship's balance. Bodies could not be thrown overboard as they were necessary for the ship's stability. Thus, overseers lived for weeks, surrounded by decomposing corpses, losing their sense of smell due to the unbearable stench. Many developed infections in their nasal passages that spread to the brain, leading to death several months after the voyage concluded. During storms, overseers had to chain the human ballast to prevent it from shifting and destabilizing the ship. They had to listen to the screams of terror and pain from dozens of people, unable to help or escape the situation themselves. Many overseers suffered hearing damage from the constant screams, and most lost the ability to sleep normally, associating darkness and confined spaces with traumatic memories. Equally repulsive was the work of masters who processed human skin for ritual purposes. They had to skin corpses while the bodies were still warm to ensure the skin remained soft enough for use in ceremonies. The process required rapid work before rigor mortis set in, often in the presence of the deceased's family members, who watched to ensure their loved one's skin was handled properly. The psychological trauma associated with skinning people in front of their families led to the development of multiple personality disorders in these masters. The chemicals used to treat the skin contained urine, animal brains, and fermented plant matter, which, when mixed, produced toxic fumes. Skin masters inhaled these fumes for hours, causing brain damage, memory loss, and difficulty forming coherent thoughts. Most could communicate only through gestures and simple words after 2 years on the job. Warriors who fell in battle became legends, but the people who performed these indispensable tasks were erased from history. Acknowledging their suffering would have undermined the system that ensured Viking prosperity. Every piece of iron, every drop of whale blubber, every funeral pyre, and every military victory was built on a foundation of human suffering so profound that death became desired rather than feared. These jobs were necessary for the functioning of Viking society, and they were performed by people who had no choice. The Vikings created a civilization where the most horrific human experiences became an everyday reality. The people who performed this work were both indispensable and expendable. The most terrible aspect was not just the physical suffering, but how Viking society structured these jobs to continue indefinitely, trapping people in cycles of suffering from which there was no escape. The dark side of the Viking Age. Whaling, arduous labor in mines, the organization of ritual ceremonies, and the maintenance of military infrastructure. All these activities ruthlessly exploited human labor. The suffering of individuals was valued solely in terms of economic benefit, completely disregarding the human cost. Understanding these aspects reveals the true foundation of Viking culture. Their society was built not only on valor and honor, but also on a systematic willingness to disregard human dignity for the sake of practical objectives. The Vikings, whose names became legendary, rose to prominence because other members of their society were in such desperate conditions that they were forced to undertake any, even the most grueling work to avoid starvation or exile from the community. This lesser-known side of history explains how Viking society could support its famed warriors and seafarers. For every Viking who set out to discover new lands or fell heroically in battle, there were dozens whose lives were consumed by arduous labor, their suffering considered commonplace. They engaged in weapon manufacturing, mineral extraction, religious ceremonies, and the provision of support systems that made Viking conquests possible. In return, they received work organized to maximally deplete their strength, yet keep them alive just long enough to continue working. This was a society that allowed the systematic infliction of suffering on a scale difficult for modern people to comprehend, and then erased this suffering from historical chronicles to preserve the heroic image of warriors and noble explorers. These labors truly existed. The people who performed them endured unimaginable torment and died in horrific conditions. Their stories were deliberately consigned to oblivion because their memory would prevent the glorification of Viking achievements without acknowledging the high price paid for them.